Thank you, Sherry. I really appreciate the opportunity to be with you today. I was very much hoping that I would get an excuse to come to Santa Monica in person. Absolutely one of my favorite cities. I love coming to Santa Monica, but I'm glad this technology solution allows us to get together, even though we can't be there in person with each other. So thank you for kind of going through some of my background. I just want to spotlight a couple of things before we jump into the formal content. While I was with the Department of Labor, I worked in an agency, as Sherry mentioned, that enforced equal employment opportunity and affirmative action regulations. And in the federal government, at that time at least, affirmative action had a very different connotation than it does in the California education system. And it's pretty much equivalent to the way that we often talk about EEO. And as many of you know, we have an EEO plan that outlines kind of how we think about our employment processes and the impact they have on people based on race and sex and other protected statuses. And that's really what the affirmative action plan in the federal government does. And all private industry and public organizations that do business with the federal government selling goods and services to cabinet level agencies had to develop a plan that's kind of very similar to our EEO plans. And I did a lot of data analysis, basically looking at years worth of hiring, promotions, terminations, the way that people got paid, were able to participate in training programs, all the benefits of employment, to see if there were disparities when you factored in someone's race, ethnicity, sex, disability status, veteran status, et cetera. And then that would guide us to do further inquiry. How do we come in and see where is that disparity happening and really isolate the cause and determine if it's a discriminatory issue or if it truly is a job-related kind of bona fide qualification that you absolutely have to have. And the person that had it was hired and the person who did not was not, and there happened to be a correlation with race, which then led into the second part of the regulations. And what I think is really key in the community college system was if we do have an issue with getting qualified people into our applicant pools, how do we address that? What kind of strategies do we use? And that looks at what is our workplace culture. It looks at where are we putting our jobs and how do we communicate within a job announcement the kind of institution we are? How do we signal to people we value equity, but we create inclusion and it's not just a boilerplate statement. And so in this presentation, I'm going to do a couple things, and the last section of it will be all about the data analysis and kind of what I just described in my work experience. How do we dig in and see exactly where we want to focus our time and energy? But I think it's really important to frame that before we get to the data with why it should matter to us. And in that conversation, we're going to have to talk about how race, ethnicity, sex, these characteristics that we all have influence our expectations about people, because that's what's happening in our hiring process, right? We look at someone's resume and we start to develop expectations around how well they might be able to do our job. We sit in an interview and we interact with them and we're reaffirming or we're creating and modifying new expectations around how they're going to perform. And we have to grapple with the fact that physical characteristics affect our expectations. And in fact, I'm playing on one of those right now with the way that I dress. And I wear a shirt and tie, a suit when we're there in person every day when I go to work, because I learned a number of years ago from a very important mentor that if you want to be taken seriously in the professional sphere, you need to understand the way that people are going to react to how you're dressed. I used to go to work, I would come right from Arizona State, and it's Phoenix, Arizona. It's 110 degrees outside. So I'm wearing shorts and a t-shirt. And he said, you are never going anywhere in my Department of Labor so long as you're dressed like that. And so he schooled me and I learned the lesson well. I went to my first management position in Chicago. I had never been there. I walked into the federal building right downtown on Van Buren. This federal building is where both of the senators from Illinois sit. It's 60 some stories. It's got heavy security. I walked in dressed in a suit and tie. I started the same week as a new regional director. So I'm coming there responsible for an office of 7 people. The regional director is responsible for 12 offices across 10 states. And I was asked 3 different times, oh, are you the new regional director? As someone put their hand out to introduce them to myself. Now, if I had walked in wearing shorts and a t-shirt, nobody would have asked me that question, right? They were seeing the way I presented myself and making all kinds of assumptions. They had expectations about me. And so as we get into this conversation and we start talking about the way that race and ethnicity and our individual characteristics affect expectations, we are going to touch on some sensitive topics, right? These are not kind of surface level ideas that we're talking. These are part of our identity as individuals. And so we have, an emotional reaction to this conversation. So I just want to set the framework that we need to talk about it, but it's framed by how this affects the way that we go through our hiring process and our employment processes. That's the framework for this conversation. And so I hope that everyone will feel comfortable sharing in this. At various points, I'm going to ask you to join in the conversation and share your perspectives, but framed by that understanding of this conversation is about kind of how we develop expectations, preferences, biases, positive and negative assumptions that then relate back to the way that we make decisions in the hiring process. And so along the way, I hope that you will feel comfortable either engaging in the chat or turning on your video and unmuting and joining the conversation and sharing your perspective. So with that framework, I'm going to go ahead and start sharing the presentation. And so we get into kind of what the agenda for the next 2 hours is. I'm going to start with what I think should always be the starting point for any discussion, which is a shared understanding of why we should care about this topic. And we each probably have an answer to that. I'm going to provide a framework as I looked at Santa Monica's mission statement and vision statement and what it's kind of communicating publicly to say, here's who we are as an institution, what I saw that I think influences why we need to care about equity when we look at our hiring process. And then we're going to spend some time talking about biases. And if I take and turn that word into a more positive construct, it's preferences, right? I have a bias for something I have a preference for. I have a bias against something I don't have a preference for it. And I think that's an important thing to understand the way that it happens in our society. And that's really what this is about. And I'll just warn you now, I'm going to use a few examples. My intent is not to beat up on Disney. It's just they make content to be understood kind of all levels, from small children to older adults, to be able to engage with their material. And so they draw things sometimes in some really obvious ways that makes for a really useful example of how content that we interact with in our world influences our preferences. And so I'm going to use some examples just to facilitate a discussion around that. I will touch on the law. It's important, especially when you get to the data analysis piece, to understand what it is that the law is saying to us about equal employment opportunity, how that then translates when we think about equity. And we'll define those terms in the context of data analysis around our hiring processes. I'll give you some examples from my experience enforcing the law on discrimination and 2 key ways the discrimination is understood in the law and how you can see it, which frames what we're going to do in our data analysis. Since I am going to talk about biases, I didn't want to just set the framework. I also wanted you to very quickly provide you with some recommendations about how do we manage bias in our process. And I'll talk about this more a little later. I think too often when we think about EEO, the idea is we're not going to talk about, we're not going to acknowledge, we're going to pretend that we're not thinking about an applicant in terms of their race, ethnicity, sex, if they're an individual with a disability, how tall they are, what color their hair is, how they dress. But the reality is, all of that is, we're visually taking that in, we're seeing it, and it is affecting our thinking. And so if we're going to be real about the fact that we see those things, then we've got to think about how do I manage biases so that whatever it is I believe personally does not influence my decision or my input into our selection processes. And then we'll get into the data analysis with all of that context around this. How can we evaluate, as we group together a number of different times that we hired, how do we evaluate what happened along the way? and how that affected applicants when we do think about their race and their sex? And can we identify barriers that are occurring so that we can look and scrutinize those? If we know that a certain aspect of our selection process, a certain criteria, has disparate outcomes, people from one race or ethnicity do much better than the other, it begs the question, is this a legitimate criteria we should continue using or not? And that's what the data can really help us get to. So along the way, as you have questions, Cyrus will be helping me to moderate the chat, raised hands. Feel free to unmute and interrupt me. I like a very kind of engaged style, so you're not going to throw me off. If you want to jump in and share something along the way, I appreciate the opportunity. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is frame this, the importance of the why, and I'm going to share a video. Some of you might have seen this. This is a couple years old now, and got popular in the K-12 system. My sister is a fourth grade teacher, and she actually introduced me to this, but it does such a beautiful job of illustrating how understanding why matters so much to what we do. And so I want to share this with you now.
Musical. You sing a song. So this is what happened at the last episode of Michael Jr.'s Break Time. Check it. So you're a musical director. Cool.
Yes, sir.
All right. So let me get a couple bars of like Amazing Grace. Can you do the first part of that? Go ahead.
Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me.
Wow. That bro could sing. You know what I'm saying? All right. Now, what you give me the version is if your uncle just got out of jail, you got shot in the back when you was a kid. I'm just saying, let me see the hood version real quick, if you know which version I'm talking about. Just see if that exists. Let me see what you got.
Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now, right now I'm found. Was blind, but now I see.
Let's go. Now. Okay. Here's what I want you to catch. The first time I asked him to sing, he knew what he was doing. The second time, he knew why he was doing it. When you know your why, your what becomes more impactful because you're walking towards or in your purpose.
Yeah, and far better than anything I could say to explain how why matters so much. Evident right there in that example. And so as we think about what is our why as an institution, I went right to the website and said, what is Santa Monica telling the public through their mission statement, what their why is? And I love what I found, right off the bat, we have this very simple mission statement. It's effective, short, right to the point. We're working in a global community. We're changing lives in a global community through excellence in education. And then I pulled out some key statements from it that We're working to help our students develop an understanding of their relationship to a diverse social, cultural, political, economic, technological, and natural environment. But that within that, each of us is empowered to make a critical contribution to the achievement of this mission. And that Santa Monica's programs and services serve diverse individuals across local, national, and global communities. That's a really big promise to come out of the gate and say, right? This is what we offer if you come here, no matter who you are. And I think this aligns well with what I've heard from Chancellor Oakley several times in our system say, you know, we serve and we admit the top 100% of students that apply. Very different than when I went to USC and they made me jump through a lot of hoops to prove that I belonged there or that they wanted to accept me in there. We say as a community college system, and Santa Monica is saying, I think right here, no matter who you are, you're going to get the benefits of this right here. You're going to walk away with a more rich understanding of your relationship to a very diverse and complex world around you. And it goes on to what I saw in the institutional learning outcomes, that when you're here, we're going to help you acquire the self-confidence to pursue your intellectual curiosities with integrity. You're going to obtain knowledge and skills that are going to allow you to access, evaluate, interpret ideas, information critically. I mean, has this skill set ever been more important to our society than it is right now in this moment, as communication technologies have allowed all kinds of information to come at us very quickly, very rapidly? How do we prepare ourselves to evaluate and interact with that information and make critical decisions? Santa Monica is promising if you come here, no matter who you are, you're going to walk away with that ability. You're going to understand and then be able to respect the interrelatedness of a global human environment. We do not operate on an island, any of us. We interact with and are part of a community. Being able to engage successfully is being able to navigate our society successfully, to be able to transform the outcomes that you're going to experience over the course of your life in terms of health and economics and lifespan, age, being able to avoid our criminal justice system. There's so many things that benefits that come through education when you understand how to do these things well, that you'll then be able to assume a level of responsibility for the impact that you have on society, on our earth, right? Through an engagement that's sustainable and ethical. And that you can use subject matter, not just have it, but engage with it. And I love that that word pops up. It was not planned, but you're going to see that again in my presentation as I talk about our hiring process. That idea of engagement becomes so critical. And so I looked then at the diversity report that you're putting together, and it's one of the most thorough and well done reports that I've seen from any community college district. I'm going to be stealing ideas from this because that's what we are as a community, right? We share things that we're doing well with each other, and you're doing a phenomenal job. But I just wanted to pull out a couple of data points in this. And what I did is took this and just grouped students here and faculty and staff into non-white. And the reason for that was just to make this as kind of visually easy to digest as possible. And there's a lot of nuance, of course, that makes this up, but it gives us a way of just understanding broadly how racial diversity is spread. And of course, what you see across the top, the red line, is the student population, which over the course of the last 20 years has increased from 63, 64% to now over 70% of the student population is non-white, matched by the classified staff, who have increased pretty significantly over those 20 years, from less than 60% to now over 70%. Of course, there are a lot fewer educational administrators, so there's a lot more volatility in the percentage. One person has a bigger impact because of the numbers, but we see that that has increased and then decreased slightly over the last 10 years. And then in our faculty, both full-time and part-time, we see that we're up over 40% now. And I'll tell you, across the districts that I've looked at, which I've probably kind of dove into about 24 districts data now at some level, one of the most diverse workforces I've seen in terms of racial diversity. Santa Monica is definitely leading in this regard among its peers. Interesting comparative local data. Of course, the city of Santa Monica looks very different than what's going on around it, right? Where we see almost the inverse. So the non-white student representation is almost exactly the opposite of the population in Santa Monica. And of course, we then look at Los Angeles County much more broadly, and that makes sense, right? Los Angeles County and Santa Monica student demographics look very similar. But it gives us a way to kind of frame our understanding of who we're serving and then what do we look like. And I did not put a lot of the research into this presentation around how student outcomes are influenced by who they see represented in the employment of the district and at all levels. I mean, the data is pretty clear, the research is pretty clear. This matters whether we're talking about who students see in kind of our frontline service jobs, people that are working in admissions and records and financial aid, that first point of contact they're having, through to the faculty member that they're in a classroom with, up to what they see in the district's leadership, who are in the roles of deans and vice presidents and the president, and the way that seeing models of people that share characteristics signals to a student, I belong here, someone like me can succeed here. We understand how valuable those things are from the research. And so as I think about that mission statement and the diversity of the student population, this is an idea that I'm bringing to this. This isn't Santa Monica's or somebody else's, but I think about kind of what that mission statement said. You're going to be able to engage in a diverse global community successfully. I think part of what we're promising to the student is you're going to come away cognitively with an ability to critically think about the complexities of a diverse society that you're going to operate in. You're going to be able to then control yourself at an emotional level and understand that when I bump into somebody who has a very different set of values, attitudes, basic understanding of the world, the right way to live in that world that can get attributed to cultural values, that I can do that in a way that's respectful, that can be curiosity oriented, rather than coming in and saying, if you think differently than I do, you are fundamentally wrong and I'm fundamentally right. And my job is to beat you over the head with the way that I think until you adopt it, which of course leads to conflict. And we're seeing that play out nationally right now. All of that then goes to how do we choose to behave? How do we conduct ourselves in a diverse world, which I think we all know is going to have huge implications for how successful we are, the ability to obtain and sustain meaningful employment, very much around that behavioral dimension, how we control the way we think and the way we feel to then translate into how we act. And so then what is the role of equity in hiring in all of this? And so that first point of how do we prepare students for the diversity of the world they're going to live in, if they never engage with that diversity within our institution. And I think that creates a really important why behind the importance of diversity in our workforce. We are modeling for students that anybody from any racial, ethnic, cultural background has the ability and the opportunity to come in and perform jobs at every level within our district. And that is an idea that hasn't always existed. We have to wrestle with this concept or this fact that 70 years ago in America, it was not only legal, it was not only socially accepted, but it was actively encouraged to discriminate in hiring, to say this is a job that a man should do, and this is a job that a woman should do, and this is a job that a white man should do, and this is a job that a Latinx, a Latino man should do. That was such a pervasive idea that if you actively went against that, if you hired a Black woman into a position that was predominantly filled with white men, other people would exert social pressure on you to conform, right? And that's not 1,000 years ago, 500 years ago, that's 70 years ago. That's just a couple generations from where we are today. Our employment systems, our education systems that we have today are founded in models that were developed at a time when discrimination, when racism, when sexism were socially encouraged, not just legal, not just accepted, but actively encouraged. And so we've got to understand that that is built into some of the frameworks, and we've got to be willing to look at that critically and examine it. With that, we have to be able to think about ourselves and our own biases and understand that we all have preferences. That's normal, that's healthy, that's natural. It's how we use them. How do we identify biases within our processes? How do we identify them in the way that we behave in the workplace, and especially in our hiring processes, and control them? That leads up to kind of our identity. And this is where it gets very difficult to separate sometimes between how I choose to conduct myself, what I think is a proper way to live, and not imposing that onto my hiring process to the point that somebody has to conform to my cultural expectations in order for me to think that they can meet that definition of best qualified. How do I divide between my identity and how I choose to live and behave in my private life from how I engage in our professional life, in our hiring processes? How do I then come into a community of diverse identities and engage in a healthy and productive way so that our diversity becomes our strength, our ability to extract ideas from a variety of perspectives on many different, from many different backgrounds, and use that to create a stronger network, not to create division within our network. And that can be difficult. And so I want to offer a little bit about my why for coming into this work. When I was with the federal government, as Sherry mentioned, a little over 12 years, I spent a lot of time figuring out that companies were hiring or promoting or paying people in a way that led to very disparate outcomes. It tended to favor one group and disfavor another. And then I would come in and cite violations and do conciliation agreements where a company had to say, okay, we understand that we discriminated against women in this position. When we hired, we're going to offer a certain number of jobs. We're going to offer back pay. And initially that felt very good. It felt like, okay, I am contributing to a more just society right now by correcting what's happened. But it didn't take long, and I think probably many of you would have gotten to this conclusion quicker than I did, that nothing I was doing was eliminating the stigma of what that person experienced, who was discriminated against. No amount of back pay, no amount of corrective action was going to take away the lived experience of having been discriminated against based on sex or based on race. And after a while, I thought, instead of coming in and trying to help companies do better, I want to get into the business of setting up and being responsible for systems that never discriminate in the first place. We're creating diversity, equity, and inclusion is fundamental to who we are and how we operate. And I can't do that from the outside. I've got to be directly involved, and human resources is the clearest place where you have a lot of influence over how these things happen, the way that we engage. And that drove me to look for opportunities. I wanted to stay in public service. For me, showing up to work and knowing that I'm contributing to the quality of the community around me means so much more than just knowing that I've helped to turn a profit. I was in sales many years ago, and I took nothing of real fulfillment from that job, and was very quickly learned that the question right after you close a big sale is, when's your next sale? There was no sustainable, meaningful engagement for me. Coming into public service, I found it. Coming back to the community college system and reflecting on the fact that without Cerro Coso Community College, I would not have had a pathway to a four-year university. My family didn't have the money to send me there. I had to work and go to school in order to make that happen. Cerro Coso offered the kinds of flexibilities that at that time especially were harder to find in four-year universities. And they offered it at a price point that I could actually make work. To be able to come back and contribute to that kind of system that is doing this broadly, I think the absolute most important thing that we have socially is the opportunity for people to have education, to contribute to that, but to do it in a way where I could influence who got to come in and participate as employees within an organization. That drives my passion for being here. That's where I really get my fulfillment. Want to stop sharing at this point and see if anybody would like to share with us your why for coming into the community college system, and specifically to be part of this community at Santa Monica. In the chat, or someone's brave enough to unmute and share out loud.
All right, I think we have Susan.
We'll start with this clip from The Little Mermaid.
Such wonderful things around you. What more are you looking for? Under the sea, under the sea. Darling, it's better down where it's wetter. Take it from me. Up on the shore, they work all day. Out in the sun, they slave away. While they devoting full time to floating under the sea. Down here, all the fish is happy as off through the waves they roll. The fish on the land ain't happy. It's hot 'cause they in the bowl. But fish in the bowl is lucky. They in for a worse fate. One day when the boss get hungry, yes, you gonna be on the plate. But no, under the sea.
Okay, I want to ask there, just anybody who's willing to volunteer some immediate thoughts, what you saw in that scene, particularly that Sebastian the Crab singing. What is he singing about? Feel free to unmute or type into the chat. Singing about fear, complacency. I heard both of those. Stay where it's safe. Very clear on that message. Don't leave us. Knowing where your place is, very strong theme of that. Change is hard. Let me ask this question. Does Sebastian have a race? Macon. Linda, if you'll share with us, what makes you say that?
Or the accent and the whole culture that they're in with the bongos and all. But he's, I mean, I that's how I read it. This is somewhere around Jamaica.
Yeah, I think Disney is very, very clear, right? They gave him a really demonstrative accent. Did anybody stop and go, wait, is that Boston? Or is that the Caribbean islands? Or is it Russian? Like, it's very, very distinct. You can't mistake it. And then you're right, the music all conforms to that, right? And so now let's go back to what he was singing about. And I think it was highlighted in a couple of the words that were used there. So he's telling Ariel, you want to stay down here under the sea, and invoke some very specific images about what happens up on the land. So anybody think about some words he used to describe what you'll do if you go up there, what's going to happen to you? You have to work hard all day long. He used a very specific word to describe how you're going to be working. Anybody pick up on it? You're going to slave away. Right? There was a conscious choice to use that word. Maybe it was careless. I kind of doubt it, given everything else that's talked about. But they invoke this idea of slavery. Not just you're going to go up there and have to work because life's a little tougher up there. It's harder to find food and shelter. But that you are going to be owned and forced into working for somebody else. And he uses a term to describe who you're going to work for. Anybody catch that term that he threw into the song? not seeing it come up. He talks about the bosses, right? And that terminology, especially for somebody that we hear with his accent, has a long history. And then Michael pointed out that basically you're going to be consumed. It's what he says, right? The fish in the bowl is lucky, because the others, you're going to be worked basically to your death and then eaten. And that's what happens up there. And so we have a character who we can very clearly hear an imposed kind of racial criteria or characteristics around. And we're invoking a history that in our country is white European descendants taking people from Africa and from other parts of the world and forcing them into ownership and work and consumption, basically. That's a lot of really heavy stuff to put in a movie that ostensibly is being marketed for, what, 7 to 14-year-olds? And it begins to create association. So the first time I watched The Little Mermaid, I did not think about any of this, right? It was, I don't know, 7 years old. None of that I understood. I had never interacted with a person who had that accent before. But I began to learn through this movie to associate things. And now if we go back and relook at what he's singing from a kind of values perspective, my grandpa did not sit me down as a young man and say, look, if you avoid work, try to find the life that allows you to be lazy and play all day, you will live life well. That's the secret to success. He told me quite the opposite, right? That hard work, being industrious, that's your pathway to success in this world. So when I hear Sebastian sing this song, I don't hear, oh, there's a character who's espousing values that are meaningful to me, that I can relate to. I hear things that get construed negatively. And it gets then tied to the perceptions around race. Now, this is the only place that I saw that maybe it doesn't really affect me. But of course, this isn't the only place in pop culture where we see this, connection happening. So I want to jump to another example of where we can see this, some of these portrayals. And so we jump to a movie that's a little bit older, and we'll talk about the era in which it came. But listen to what's happening in this scene.
Dumbo, the ninth wonder of the universe, the world's only flying elephant. Did you ever see an elephant fly?
Well, I seen a horse fly.
I seen a dragon fly.
I seen a house fly.
See, I seen all that too. I seen a peanut stand and heard a rubber band. I seen a needle that winked its eye. But I be done seeing about everything when I see an elephant fly.
What you say, boy?
I said when I see an elephant fly. I seen the front porch swing, heard a diamond ring. I seen a polka dot railroad tie. But I be done seeing about everything when I see an elephant fly.
Somebody, just what you observed happening in that scene. I know I've primed you, so you're already thinking about race and depictions. So we can go right to it. Somebody share what they saw. You see humiliation and intimidation right away. Timothy the Mouth steps up and says, here's something really amazing, and he gets laughed at and mocked. We see bullying, absolutely. You can't physically intimidate Dumbo if you're a crow, but you sure can Timothy, right? We see him use his size to back him down. What else stood out? Fear of the unknown. If you're different than us, we're going to reject you. Mm-hmm. Let me ask this. Do the crows have a race? Al Jolson, which invokes what they're doing as well, the singing, the entertainer. We'll talk a little bit about that. If you're going to place the Crows racially, geographically, what would you say? They seem like New Orleans jazz musicians, Southern Black accents, right? They're very clear that, again, you didn't hear that and mistake that for, was that a French speaker that I was hearing? They gave a very clear accent. You hear the use of the language, the invariable be, not conjugating the verb. I'd be done seeing about everything. I mean, that's just one step removed from Shakespeare's English, right? No, they're very intentional about it. And Deborah's jumping, ahead, absolutely, that these cartoons perpetuate racial stereotypes. And that's jumping ahead right to kind of what I'm ultimately making the point of in here. And so thinking about what are the Crows doing? When we come into the scene, what are they doing? Hanging out, laughing. I mean, you could almost picture like brown paper bags, right? So once again, we have characters that have a clear voicing. Yeah, Linda, I agree, drinking. They have clear voicing. The clothing and presentation is all suggesting a Southern United States Black kind of culture, right? With a lot of negatives attributed to it. A culture of, they're not hardworking, they're mocking somebody, they're physically intimidating. What do they do well? The lead Crow in the scene has some positive traits, right? What are they? You can see. Singing and dancing, really good, right? Amazing vocalist. A lot like Sebastian the Crab. And is this not a very common stereotype that entertaining and athletes, right? That's the two places that we see many examples of success for Black males, to the exclusion though in other pursuits. And so it reinforces this association. The first time I saw the movie Dumbo, I had not interacted with, I grew up in Southern California in the desert. I had not interacted with somebody from Georgia or from New Orleans or Florida or South Carolina who had that voice. I didn't know what values to attribute to them other than what I had seen kind of repeatedly through these presentations. Let's do one more. I think we've probably gotten to the point, but a little different way of looking at it with one more example.
It's not funny, Ed. Hey, shut up! Will you knock it off? Well, he started it. Look at you guys. No wonder we're dangling at the bottom of the food chain. Man, I hate dangling. Yeah? If it weren't for those lions, we'd be running the joint. Yeah, man, I hate lions. So pushy. And hairy. Stinky. And man, are they ugly.
Oh, surely we lions are not all that bad.
Oh, Scars, just you.
We were afraid it was somebody important.
Yeah, you don't like Mufasa.
Yeah.
I see.
Now that's power.
Tell me about it. I just hear that name and I shudder.
Mufasa.
Ooh. Do it again.
Mufasa. Mufasa, Mufasa, Mufasa.
Ooh, it tingles me.
I'm surrounded by idiots.
Writing's not that easy.
So let me ask, what do you see happening in this scene from The Lion King? We hear about a social hierarchy dangling at the bottom of the food chain. So clearly the lions are on top, the hyenas feel as though they're on the bottom. Yeah, I'm going to come back to that word idiots that gets used. But clearly there is an intellectual commentary happening. Making fun of, othering, absolutely. What are the hyenas doing when we come into the scene? Bickering with each other. I'll come back to that comment in a second, Laurie. Picking on each other, hanging out, not really engaged in anything productive, not industrious. Similar pattern to what we saw in the other, right? We came across characters, and we had Laurie pointed this out, with distinct voices, who none of which are engaged in any kind of what we would call productive, industrious type behavior at all. And so, Laurie, you mentioned Hispanic and Black vocal patterns. Does anybody know who the actors are that are voicing? There's two famous actors voicing two of those hyenas, Cheech Marin and Whoopi Goldberg, right? And we're very clear in using voicing that portrayed their ethnicity with that, right? Yes, and Laurie points out Jeremy Irons Scar. I'm going to get to that it's a very interesting thing, and you've already picked up on it, that's happening with that. But we have very clear voices that again suggest a race or an ethnicity that are then characterized with negative attributes in the way that we would traditionally think about them in American culture, and kind of the white European culture that informs. And so we get this negative association being reinforced again, negative stereotypes being reinforced again. And then, yeah, Lion King does a really interesting thing with bringing in Scar, voiced by Jeremy Irons. Where's Jeremy Irons from? Does anybody know? He's a Scottish actor from the United Kingdom. And where is the Lion King set? What presumption would you make? Set in Africa. And what is the history of Britain in Africa? I don't know that it was intentional to invoke that. Maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. But if it was careless or not, it is absolutely invoked by having that. You have a character with that voice coming into this environment. You have these associations of positive and negative connotations that come with it. And it's all right there. It's not very far beneath the surface. Is a 9-year-old going to pick up on this? Not immediately, but very quickly they're going to be learning some of this history. And these associations are being perpetuated by this. And we see this over and over and over again. I want to jump back, and I missed one thing that I wanted to point out with the Dumbo example. Does anybody know the name that they gave to the lead crow? It's actually in the credits of the movie. It's not said in the scene. Yeah, Travis has it. It's Jim. And of course, I assume everybody knows why having a character called Jim Crow that has all of those other characterizations going with him is such a, in today's culture, shocking thing that they would do. I think in the 1940s, far less so. Again, going back to the point I was making earlier, that it was not only legal and socially acceptable, but encouraged to make race and sex-based decisions in employment in that era. And so we can see that those artifacts in pop culture. And it's not just Disney, and it's not just what we see in those examples, but we see it more broadly across popular culture. And so just a few examples of this that I'll walk through. You have the top right, a scene from The Green Mile, where you have in Michael Clarke Duncan, a very physically imposing character. Clearly, he is the most powerful person in this shot right here. But all of that physical dominance is brought under control by the intellectual order of the white characters around him. Their ability to use their intellect and to create structures to contain him is highly effective. It's not a point of the story that's being made here, but it's clear in this image. And I went looking for the inverse of this image. Where could I find an example of Black characters who had used their intellect and structure in order to subdue the physical threat of a white character? I didn't find it. I didn't spend an exhaustive amount of time. But needless to say, I wouldn't need much time to find more examples of what we see from The Green Mile. We don't see this very often portrayed the other way. Black characters have a few different stereotypes that we see. Down below, The Legend of Bagger Vance, you have Will Smith, who is a character with no real history in this movie. He comes into the movie, he's an important character, but his importance is entirely framed with how he affects the journey of Matt Damon, who is absolutely the main character, who undergoes an evolution as a character. Will Smith doesn't have a backstory as he comes in and as he leaves. He's far more mystical in his presence, but he's not a fully formed person. And that's very similar to the way that Sam, moving over to the left, in Casablanca is portrayed. They never give Sam a backstory. We don't know how and why he winds up attached to Rick. This is Rick's story, and he's there very much like the setting of the background, just to facilitate the telling of Rick's story. When Black characters are given more prominence within the story, they often aren't given depth. And so if we look above that at Training Day, in this image of Denzel Washington, there's all kinds of visual symbols here to tell us what kind of character it is. He's got a black cap on, he's wearing a lot of big chains, a black leather jacket, he's holding a gun to his side. He is a villain in this movie, and there's no question about that. And it's not questioned by us as we watch it for the most part. Up in the top left, the trope of the angry Black woman in American film has been so pervasive that Tyler Perry made an entire movie lampooning that idea, made a parody out of it quite successfully, because that is such a pervasive stereotype that we see. For Latinx characters, it doesn't get much better. If you've watched the series Breaking Bad, that top right picture, you know there are two criminals in that picture. And I would argue that Saul Goodman on the right, the white character, is responsible for far more destruction and criminality and a threat to society than Tuco, the character on the left. But the way that he's portrayed with that large gun, the physically menacing, almost looks like he's on drugs in this picture, is portrayed as a far bigger social threat that fits into an entire narrative and stereotype around how we think he is a character from Mexico in the story. The way that gets portrayed. Down below that, a television show which features a predominantly Latina cast, but cast as criminals, as convicts, as violent. The portrayal of particularly Mexican and Mexican Americans in film, as you see in The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly right next to that, there are several things that we can just do visually, and you see it in the cartoon images up above there. But that actor with Clint Eastwood is Eli Wallach. Eli Wallach is a Jewish man from New York, but you put on a sombrero and you dirty up the clothes and you give him a thin mustache and he becomes a Mexican outlaw very quickly. All those stereotypes just reinforcing a negative perception. For women, you have to the left there, Jennifer Lopez in a housekeeping role as a sexy Latina. You see that right above that in the image from Modern Family. I would challenge you to find the example in American television of the highly successful aging Latina with her spicy, sexy, much younger white pool boy to her side, right? We don't see that stereotype happen. Well, we see this frequently. And then up at the very top left, there was some positive initial response to the idea of a television show. This is a couple years ago now, but having an all Latina cast. that was cast as devious maids. There's nothing positive about that portrayal, right? As we look at how do people then kind of see these images and these stereotypes, and how does it affect the way we think, we see these kind of patterns exist. And so a group did a study on how immigrant characters are portrayed in television. And less than 10% of the time, if the immigrant character is white, they're portrayed as a criminal. If they're Latino, 50% of the time. They're Black 33% of the time. We see this idea of kind of fearing the immigrant of color, but not the white immigrant, perpetuated in these stereotypes and these portrayals. The media is no better in this. And so I'm going to walk through these next two slides, telling you just what the pictures suggest to me, just looking at the pictures, and then acknowledging what the headlines are telling us. So on the top right, my first thought is, I see a criminal probably involved in gang activity or drugs who shot a cop in the line of duty. When I read the headline, I see a campus police who got his academy photo that shot and killed a driver of a car. That image does not tell that story. The image tells me that, well, now that I read the headline, that driver must have had a reason why he needed to be killed. You clearly look at his face. Down below on the left, on the bottom left of the screen, I have a woman on the left whose child died in a park adjacent to her house. I have a picture on the right of a young man who went to Stanford and raped an unconscious woman behind a dumpster. The pictures tell me that on the left, I have a derelict mother who was probably involved in drugs or something that couldn't be bothered to pay attention to her child. And on the right, I have a polite young man who got his yearbook photo up here, who was probably being falsely accused by somebody who was out for something. On the top of this screen, I have on the left a young man who grew up, walked into a church in South Carolina and shot several Black parishioners. On the right, I have a young man who shielded his mother from gunfire and died in the act of saving her life. The pictures suggest to me that the person on the left was a nice young man that was probably influenced by external evil sources that changed his behavior in unfortunate ways. But on the right, I have a young man who was probably involved in something he shouldn't have been that brought his violence to his mother, and it's really his fault. On the bottom left, I have 3 college students who are charged with burglary, but I see their yearbook photos here, and I think these are probably polite young men who just got caught up in the wrong thing, maybe even falsely accused. On the right, I have 4 men who are charged with burglary, but clearly giving me their mugshot suggests that they're guilty and that they are a threat to society. On the right, I have 2 European soccer league stars, or people that haven't quite proven themselves. On the left, the Black athlete splashes out lavishly on a mansion, perhaps spending more money than he should before he's proven himself. But on the right, the whiter character is buying a very similarly priced home for his mom. And isn't that nice, polite young man, just like me? These images influence the way that we perceive race and the way that we think about positive and negative attributions that come with race. And the importance of understanding that is, how does that affect the way that we make decisions in our hiring process? And how do we think about people when we very quickly see information visually or in somebody's name, and the positives and negatives that get attributed to it? It's impossible for me to go through, my day in society without the history of all of these things that I've seen in the past and what continues to be put in front of me today, without that influencing me in some way. I'm not smart enough to completely disassociate repeated images that characterize race in positive or negative terms and say, okay, I'm not going to be influenced by that. That's a very active, conscious thing I have to engage in. If I'm not thinking critically, I'm very likely to make these same attributions and to use that when I make judgments quickly. So, studies on how stereotypes impact our thinking. News and media portrayals, very commonly, everything that I just showed you is not atypical, use stereotypes to portray things to us. We do it for comedic effect, we do it for dramatic effect, we do it so that people can very quickly consume information and reach conclusions. But those stereotypes exacerbate negative opinions. And so when I see that attribution of lazy with a character who's given a Southern Black voicing, I very quickly start to make that attribution before I know anything about a person. And I start to believe that that must be true more broadly until I actually have direct interaction. And so the first time that I'm working alongside a Black man who is hardworking and industrious, I go, wow, that violates kind of the stereotype that I had. And the first time we hear someone experience that, it may come out in a really negative way. She's very hardworking for a woman, which is entirely a negative sentence, right? That is not a positive compliment, really. The second time we start to question, oh, wow, that's the second person I've met. By the third and fourth experience, we're really having to confront our stereotype. It can't be that I've met the 4 people that are exceptions to this general rule, right? It can't be that I just ran into randomly. As we have repeated experience, exposure, familiarity, we begin to start unlearning the stereotype, which gets to the heart of why diversity in our workforce is so important, because these ideas are out there. We're learning them, our students are learning them, but it's the exposure that changes that stereotype and does really wonderful things for creating a more complex understanding of society and being able to go back and watch those movies again and say, now I can see this from a different lens. The first time I watched Lion King, it was fun to laugh at the hyenas, to make fun of the hyenas. Now when I see that, I understand that something far more pervasive is happening, messages around race that are being shared. We also see this in our history and in our art. And I want to jump over now and share another example, but moving now into out of the realm of popular media and into more academic pursuits.
I love museums. Have you guys ever been to the Natural History Museum? Oh, yeah. In New York City? So, one of the things that I do is I take my kids to the museum. Recently, took them to the Natural History Museum. Have my 2 sons with me, Savian and Davin. And we go into the front entrance of the museum, and there's that amazing sculpture of Teddy Roosevelt out there. You guys know which one I'm talking about. Teddy Roosevelt is sitting there with one hand on the horse, bold, strong, sleeves rolled up. I don't know if he's bare-chested, but it kind of feels like it. And on the left-hand side of him is a Native American walking. And on the right-hand side of him is an African American walking. And as we're moving up the stairs, getting closer to the sculpture, my oldest son, who's 9, says, "Dad, how come he gets to ride and they have to walk?" It stopped me in my tracks. It stopped me in my tracks. There was so much history that we would have to go through to try to explain that. And that's something I try to do with them anyways. That's a question that I probably would have never really asked. But fundamentally what he was saying was, that doesn't look fair. Dad, that doesn't look fair. And why is...
So I want to, as soon as I can, sorry, get this paused. I want to show you, in case you have not seen it, what that sculpture he's referring to looks like. And this has actually come up recently in over the course of the summer. This statue has been taken out of the front of the Natural History Museum in New York, but this here is the sculpture. And so you can see in the full picture to the left what he describes, right? This really powerful image of Teddy Roosevelt. I don't know if he's bare-chested, but it feels like it. He's very much in charge and command of this entire situation. And as he describes, to the right, he has a Native American, and to the left, a Black character. And as you look at this, through his 9-year-old son's eyes, he immediately sees the racial inequity happening. Presumably, he looked at this and found himself represented in that Black character and thought, why is the person who looks like me in this kind of subordinate position? And he's not perhaps thinking in those terms as a 9-year-old, but he sees the inequity right away. An inequity that's so pervasive that, as Titus describes, the speaker, as his father, had walked past this many times and never really given it any thought. There's nothing unusual about this. If you rearranged where the characters were at in this sculpture, it probably would have stopped him long before that moment, because that's unusual to see. Does anybody know what the Native American and Black characters in this sculpture, who they are and what their role is? I realize as I ask that, I can't see the chat while I have full screen on. So I'll just go ahead and jump in and answer the question. The artist calls them hunting guides. They don't have identities the way that Teddy Roosevelt does, but calls them hunting guides. Now, when I hear that term hunting guides, the first thing I'm going to think of is these were two industrious people who recognized that they had a skill set that was marketable, set up a small business and contracted out their services, and just happened to have Teddy Roosevelt come along and hire them. That's probably not at all what happened, right? You can see, and that's why I've blown the image up there on the right, the way that their hands are attached and we can't see behind his legs. And unfortunately, I've not been to New York to get behind and see what's going on there. But it's very easy to see that and almost infer that they're bound, like they are tied to the side of the horse. But we know this moment in history in the early 1900s, late 1800s, and we know the hierarchy of race that existed at that time and what was legal. It's very unlikely that that's the scenario, right? That they are here willingly participating in something necessarily, but that this is what they have been forced into to some respect. And that's not historically inaccurate. As we look at this, the problem is not, it's telling a story that isn't true. It's telling a story that is true. But what, in hearing even Titus talk about it, the ability to just walk by this image without registering and thinking critically about that, it's so pervasive, the hierarchy of race in our culture, that it becomes that normalized that we can just walk right past it. I came across this TED Talk not looking for material for a conversation or a presentation like this, but I was just interested in what he was talking about with art. And he goes in to talk about presentations of race in art and does some interesting things to call people's attention to it. But along the way, he tells a story that gets right to the heart of who we are as a community college system. And I want to share that segment of this. I've watched this a number of times now. I always bring more away from it. But it just astounded me the first time with how this describes, I think as clearly as any example I've seen, why equity is so important to us if we're going to achieve our mission of student success. And I want to share this with you now.
Is there a way for us? Now, I didn't grow up going to museums. That's not my history. My mother was 15 years old when I was born. She is amazing. My father was struggling with his own things for most of my life. If you really want to know the truth, the only reason I got into art is because of a woman. There was this amazing, fantastic, beautiful, smart woman, 4 years older than me, and I wanted to go out with her. But she said, "You're too young and you're not thinking about your future." So I ran on down to the junior college, registered for some classes, ran on back, and basically was like, "I'm thinking about my future now. Can we go out?" For the record, she's even more amazing. I married her. So when I randomly ran down to the junior college and registered for classes, I really wasn't paying attention to what I was registering to. So I ended up with an art history class, and I didn't know a thing about art history. But something amazing happened when I went into that class. For the first time in my academic career, my visual intelligence was required of me. For the first time. The professor would put up an image, bold strokes of blues and yellows, and say, "Who's that?" And I go, "That's Van Gogh. Clearly, that is Van Gogh. I got this." I got a B in that class. For me, that was amazing. In high school, let's just say I wasn't a great student, okay? In high school, my GPA was 0.65. Decimal point first, 6.5. So me getting a B was huge, huge, absolutely huge. And because of the fact that I realized that I was able to learn things visually that I couldn't learn in other ways, this became my strategy, this became my tactic for understanding everything else. I wanted to stay in this relationship, things were going well. I decided, let me keep taking these art history classes. One of the last art history classes I will not forget, I'll never forget. It was one of those survey art history classes. Anybody ever have one of those survey art history classes? Where they try to teach you the entire history of art in a single semester. I'm talking about cave paintings and Jackson Pollock, like just crunched together all in the same. It doesn't really work, but they try anyway. Well, at the beginning of the semester, I looked at the book, and in this 400-page book was about a 14-page section that was on Black people in painting. Now, this was a crammed-in section that had representations of Black people in painting and Black people who painted. It was poorly curated. Let's just put it that way. Nonetheless, I was really excited about it because in all the other classes that I had, we didn't even have that conversation. We didn't talk about it at all. So imagine my surprise when I get to class and on the day that we're supposed to go over that particular chapter, my professor announces, we're going to skip this chapter today because we do not have time to go through it. Whoa, I'm sorry, hold on. Professor, I'm sorry. This is a really important chapter to me. Are we gonna go over it at any point? Titus, we don't have time for this. I'm sorry. Please, I really need to understand. Clearly the author thinks that this is significant. Why are we skipping over this? Titus, I do not have time for this. Okay, last question. I'm really sorry here. When can we talk? Because we need to talk. I went to her office hours. I ended up getting kicked out of her office. I went to the dean. The dean finally told me, I can't force her to teach anything. And I knew in that moment, if I wanted to understand this history, if I wanted to understand the roles of those folks who had to walk, I was probably gonna have to.
Sorry, I cut him off just a second short. He says I was gonna have to figure that out for myself. And so I hope we can have a little bit of a conversation, and if you're willing to unmute and even perhaps turn on your video, that would be great. If not, please use the chat. But what he's talking about in there, and at first I think it's important to acknowledge that we have one side of the interaction. We don't get to hear from the professor, and there may be more context. His representation of the conversation might not be exactly what happened from the professor's perspective. But if we just take it at face value at this story, it raises a lot of really interesting questions for us, given what we do. I see Jocelyn with the hand up. If you want to unmute and make a comment, please.
This was emotional to me to watch this because this is exactly what happened to me in an English class. When I was at CSUN, I was a writing major, and the same thing happened with Black Renaissance. And I've told my students about this, that a teacher literally at the beginning of the class said, I just want to let you know, I don't teach about the Black Renaissance because I don't think it's a thing. I literally learned that in a class. And when I've gone to people and told people this, this is just shocking that I'm the only I always thought that I was the only person that had this experience. Which is why this is one of the reasons where I like to share my experience in education with a lot of the students that I've had, because oftentimes people who are non-Black don't know about these experiences yet within our communities. And especially, I'm speaking to my students right now that go to Santa Monica College. And as much as we want to say that Santa Monica College is this place that, we don't have these kinds of issues, my students are having these same issues right now in 2020. And so I think that this needs to be spoken to with regard to, I don't know what the solution is because it's been happening obviously for generations and generations. I'm 42, so I was in college 20 years ago when this happened. But knowing that this has happened, it is it's very uncomfortable to have that conversation in an environment like Santa Monica College, where he's saying he spoke to the dean. I've spoken to department chairs and they're like, they have tenure, they can do what they choose. And you don't have any power as a student. So it was really emotional for me to watch that.
Thank you for sharing your experience, Jocelyn. You made a really important point that it's easy to feel isolated in that experience. Like, this is just happening to me. You're absolutely right. It's happening to a lot of students, but not students who look like me. I haven't had a single class over the entire course of my educational career where I didn't have myself, my cultural background represented somewhere in that class. And I say that having taken, I was an English undergrad, as you heard in the intro, having taken Latin American, South American, African literature courses, there was always room for me in there. I don't know what it's like to be Titus or to be you, Jocelyn, and to go into a class and not see myself. And Angela pointed this out in the chat. I don't have time for this is a polite way of saying what? This is not a priority. Right? We all have the same 24 hours a day. We have the same amount of seconds in every hour. It's what we choose to spend them on. And I don't have time for this. This isn't important enough. We're going to move on to something that's more important. And I think about my experience, especially in my English literature undergrad. It wasn't until I got to community college at Cerro Coso that I had an instructor who, in an American literature survey class, introduced and started with Indigenous literature. It was the first time that happened. All through my high school career, we did not. I mean, we basically started with Hemingway or Tennessee Williams or something that fit into what's been the conventional canon. And it was shocking when it happened because it seemed so obvious after the fact. Of course, this is American literature. These are people who were here creating stories and telling stories for a very long time before anybody showed up here from Europe or from some other place. Why have they not been included? My education was incomplete. And if I did not have that introduction, how could I walk around saying, yes, I understand literature and can conversate on that in an intellectual way and have this giant gap in my knowledge? This hurts everyone to not have this be part of it. And you raised then, Jocelyn, I think the really important questions, especially when we think about hiring, is what do we look for to make sure that we're hiring instructors coming in who are not going to have that mentality, who are not going to have to be told this is something you need to think about, but who are already thinking about it. And that's difficult. I'm going to bring the slides back up just because I've kind of put a couple of questions that might help you. Make sure I get the right thing shared, sorry. That might help you kind of think about some of the topics around this. There we go. And so other people with thoughts on kind of that experience or starting to contextualize this, kind of how does that interaction fit? What would you be looking for as you're hiring for signals about how somebody's going to engage in this moment? What might effective responses look like if you think that the instructor, given what he tells us, and if we just accept that to be true, how might that be handled?
Figure that out myself.
Sorry, bring this up so I can see the chat while I'm doing this. Susan, please.
Yeah, I mean, in the scheme of most people at the college, I think I've been here I'm still considered new, so it's been under 4 years. But on the few hiring committees I've been on to hire, I'm thinking of faculty positions in particular. We always do ask and infuse in questions related to equity, diversity, and inclusion. And I guess what's coming up for me is like, how do we dig a little bit deeper and get to know the candidates a little bit better by seeing how they could, what their work looks like in a teaching classroom. It's hard to see that on paper when you look at someone's experience. And it's hard to see it when you spend an hour with them. So what are some of the, and I know HR does a great job at this, but I guess I'm just thinking through, I mean, I'm thinking I was part of a hiring committee to hire a faculty member who, I really don't know anything about the subject matter, but it would have been nice to see what topics they would have selected to teach and how they would have shared that with us as a classroom, as one way to demonstrate how they view their role as an instructor at Santa Monica College.
Yeah, thank you, Susan. I think the really important point you make, we have very limited exposure. So if we're going to try to get at this, we have to be very direct, explicit, and intentional about it. We've got to come out and ask the questions in very direct ways. How do you incorporate a variety of cultural examples into your syllabus, into your curriculum? And I would say that applies across the board to every discipline. It's easy to think, well, in math, 2 + 2 is always 4. There is no DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion component to math. No, there certainly is. The way that we choose to create examples, and there's been a lot of discussion around that. Of course, the way that word problems in math get written and the kind of effect that has on different students. But it's embedded into everything. And so we've got to be very intentional when we do it. We're going to explicitly ask for this. It's not going to be kind of a coded question that if they know how to answer the right way, but just straight out ask and then evaluate. How's that person going to engage with our students? We know our students are more than 70% non-white. Are they going to be able to engage effectively with that student population? Other thoughts, reactions? I agree, Rob. Yeah, so certainly the bias that we think about, just the characteristics of somebody as they walk into the room, somebody who's wearing a hoodie and has a face tattoo, I'm reacting to that information, right? And there may be biases and preferences, some of which I don't recognize immediately, but some I very unconsciously controlling. But then there's also biases around expertise in the discipline. And as I've had conversations around this particular story that Titus tells, one of the things that has come up is the instructor in this example might be avoiding this topic because it was not part of her education in art. She was never taught this history and doesn't feel like I can come in and teach it and skips over it, which I think is a very real thing that we deal with when we get confronted with somebody's cultural background that we aren't familiar with. And we're trying to kind of move quickly and maintain our kind of control over the situation, dismissing it as the quickest way to get there. Like, oh, we're just going to not deal with that, and I'm going to go on with what I had planned. We have to, in a role serving students, and the example is about faculty, but I'd say this goes to every single job in our institution. The ability to be mindful of that before the interaction happens. So if I'm not proactively working on understanding when this moment comes, in some ways preventing it from coming, right? If the instructor in this example is thinking about this beforehand, how do I teach the history of different groups, communities, nations in our understanding of art and that canon? How do I grapple with that and infuse that into my curriculum? I think the point that you were driving towards, Susan. If I'm working at the front counter in admissions and records, how do I engage with a student who, as Titus described, the K-12 system was not successful for him? And he says, I had other things going on in my life. It may have very well been as much about the way that he was engaged with by the people he interacted with. how do I do that differently to make sure that I'm serving the student in front of me? I see who they are and I serve them so that they can be successful. Whether that is they already know the majority of what they need and I'm just here to facilitate, or they need someone who can help guide them through this process. Because nobody is born understanding how college admissions works, right? We have to learn that. So in the interest of time, I'm going to move on. I hope that as it's done for me, I think about this often, and every time I do, I understand it in different ways, and it adds complexity to my thinking about how individuals come into our system and interact with it, and the differences in the interactions based on their race, and how we can do a better job of being mindful of that and better serve all of our students from the diversity of the backgrounds that they're coming from. And I think that has to be a very intentional thing. Okay, so I want to move now into the more kind of legal framework, and then we'll get into kind of how we deal with some of these very challenging issues. So EEO and the legal framework is an idea I think everybody has probably come to understand. It's the entry point. Is it open and accessible for anyone to get in the door? Can everybody apply for the job? And so this addresses that legal history of white man wanted for. You can't do that anymore. You have to accept all applicants regardless of their race, sex, ethnicity, etc. All of these protected statuses that we get in the law. EEO says we must do that. EEO does not look at what happens at the outcome though, just at the starting point. And so when we think beyond the legal requirement, we get to the equity idea, which is, did you actually succeed? And it forces us to acknowledge the fact that there are systemic barriers that impact communities that have been minoritized, that have been treated differently in our processes. The standards may be objective, the application has not been. And I'm going to give you some examples of that, but just to kind of round out our definition of these terms, the equality model is everybody's getting the same thing. If you had different outcomes, that's because of the way that you chose to interact. It's what you brought into this. It very much puts the blame on the person for their outcomes. And it ignores anything that might be happening structurally influencing those outcomes. Equity starts with the understanding that everybody does not get the same. We have positive and negative attributions to all of those protected statuses in the law, and many other characteristics that we think of positively and negatively. And so sometimes this gets portrayed as someone trying to help somebody. If I went and applied for an early childhood education program, would someone pull me aside and explain to me that there aren't a lot of men in this field and that oftentimes they struggle with the need to be more compassionate or whatever it is we think makes women better suited to do this work? At some point, is somebody going to educate me on the hurdles I'm about to face, which become a barrier in itself, right? Like, oh, you're discouraging me from doing this, basically, or making sure I understand this isn't going to be easy. Those things exist, they happen, they're real. The institutions, the policies, the rules, we're coming out of a history where they've been created by the group that has been considered the majority, both just in raw numbers, but in the possession of power to create these things. And it's very easy to intentionally create rules that will exclude, or to do it unintentionally because we're not being thoughtful about it. And I say unintentionally with a kind of asterisk on it, that at some point, refusing to think about the outcomes that happen becomes an intentional act in my mind. At some point, you are consciously deciding, I'm not going to care if what I've set up works for other people. As long as it generally works for people like me, I'm fine with it. That becomes an intentional act, I think, at some point. Biases that we hold will create barriers that will have an exclusion outcome from them. And individual behaviors start to get dictated in part by the structures that are in place. And I think we all get challenged with this, where we know what we want to do, but the law or the rules prevent us from doing that. We say, well, I'm just following the policy on this. And our behavior starts to perpetuate the exclusion. It takes an active, conscious effort to do this differently, to not just rely on the biases and the preferences that we have. And I want to use a personal example here. And I'll preface this by saying, my mother and I have a great relationship. I love her. But she very much believes over the course of her life and what she's been taught and what she's observed, and there's probably a lot of selection bias in this, but that women tend to not be as good at managing in a professional sense as men do. She fundamentally believes this true. She has a lot of examples of female leaders that did it poorly. And her and I have gone round and round on this issue. As you can imagine, right from the start of my work in EEO and affirmative action, I came in and kind of challenged this notion. And there's no amount of data, there are no amount of examples that I can bring that have changed her mind on this. And so if she wanted to participate in a hiring committee at the San Diego Community College District, I wouldn't let her. If we're hiring for an administrator, no way. Because I don't believe that she can set aside the bias. It's so fundamentally rooted in her understanding that she can't participate. Now, if she could demonstrate to me, I generally believe this, but I can isolate that belief from how I behave in our hiring process and the way that I screen applicants and what I hear in interviews. If I can suspend that bias and make a decision absent that, then it would be fine. She's just never demonstrated to me that capacity. But that's what we have to wrestle with, that it takes an active, conscious effort. And so in discrimination, there are two theories under the law that we should be mindful of as we do this work. Disparate treatment is the obvious form of discrimination. That's what happens when somebody says, I see that you're a woman, I'm not going to hire you. I see that you're a man, I'm not going to promote you. Disparate treatment doesn't happen as often as it used to. It's no longer legal. It was once. But it absolutely does still happen. But what we see more often is disparate impact. And that is where something that on its face appears to be neutral results in disproportionate outcomes. And so an example of this from a real case that I worked on was a company that produced electronic components. And then they had a fairly large warehouse and shipping operation to distribute the components out to suppliers. And so I ran some initial data on who they hired, and they hired a lot more men than they did women to work in those warehouse jobs. And it was enough that it triggered a initial, prima facie finding of potential discrimination in here. The numbers are so disparate that I have to assume that there's a correlation and maybe some causal relationship between sex and your hiring decision. And so we came out and actually saw the work being performed. I talked to human resources folks, I talked to managers in that area. They told me all about the criteria that they had. And one of the criteria in the hiring process was the ability to lift 100 pounds. And they showed me the job description. It was clearly stated in there, you have to be able to do this. So they would actually have somebody lift a box that weighed 100 pounds. And if they couldn't do it, they were told, no, thank you. And so then I asked to go into the warehouse. And you probably can imagine what I saw. This was 2006. When I walked into that warehouse, do you think that I saw anybody lifting boxes of 100 pounds? I did not. I saw a lot of machines moving way more than 100 pounds, far more quickly than any human could do. And so after watching this for several minutes and being told about how wonderful this new modernized operation was and the decrease in workers' compensation and workplace injuries and all this wonderful stuff, I asked, when in this process does someone lift 100 pounds? And the HR person that was with me and the manager immediately saw what had happened, that our position description states this 100-pound thing. Our position description hasn't been updated since the late 1980s. And in the 1980s, we didn't have this big modern operation with machines. We had people moving boxes. But we never changed the criteria that we were hiring for as the operation modernized. And so this was no longer an actual job-based requirement. You did not need to be able to lift 100 pounds. You had to be able to work equipment that moved considerable weight around. And so that becomes a form of discrimination because it's not job related anymore to have that in place. And I saw this happen in a number of different ways. The history behind when disparate impact came into the law is also very illustrative of how this can be used maliciously. So right after the passage of Title VII of the Civil Rights Act in 1964, a power company in North Carolina called Duke Power changed their job requirements. For every job in the company, you now had to have at least a high school diploma. Well, the history of education in America, just 6 years before that, 1958, Brown versus Board of Education, racial segregation in schools was entirely legal. And having a high school diploma, if you were Black in North Carolina in 1964, was no easy feat at all. And so they fired people that had been working in the company for decades, and they would not hire people that didn't have a high school diploma. And there was a very clear negative impact based on your race. And so that was challenged by the NAACP, and the case made it all the way to the Supreme Court before it was decided. And what came out of the legal opinion was that disparate treatment, that obvious, we will not hire you if you are insert your race, that was one form, but a policy that excluded people from employment based on race, not because it was explicitly written to do so, but because that was the effect of it, was also discriminatory if you couldn't show that it was completely required to do that job. So if you absolutely had to have a high school diploma, it would have been legal. But the reality was, as decades of operation showed, you didn't need a high school diploma. The company was finding a way to discriminate in a more covert kind of way. And so we have to be worried about this in the criteria that we use as we select applicants. And part of that is what happens in our screening, in our interview processes, that we're being proactive about controlling biases. And I'll talk about in a moment here how we can see it in the data. But very quickly want to offer just some things. I didn't create this as kind of an academic presentation where I'm citing all the sources, but if you look up literature around biases and manage these, you'll find these elements. That first, we are more likely to make a quick decision based on preferences around characteristics like race and sex and ability status when we're under emotional stress. I think we've all experienced this. Something happens, we react in anger, and later we wish we'd reacted differently. That's the moment when I hear myself say things and go, I sound just like my dad right now, and I promised myself I was never going to do that. If we lack objective info, and so this is the problem that we were talking about in the selection process, we have, a little bit of paper, and then we have an hour to get to know somebody. That's not a lot of information about them. And now we've got to make a decision. So what are we going to rely on? Going back to the example of my mother, well, absent some obvious information that this woman would be a really effective manager, generally going to assume that the men are more qualified. The expectations we have around people, again, going back to the way that I dress and how that influences expectations. Many people see this and think professional, competent, there's a certain amount of economic status that's being portrayed. You might look and think a little bit rigid, too much of a rule follower. I wear the pink so that you know that he can have fun with it. But there are a lot of expectations that come visually, and we start categorizing very quickly. If we're distracted, if we have multiple things going on while we're trying to review applications, we're more likely to rely on superficial information. If we're under pressure, I only have a limited amount of time to make this decision. I don't have time to get all the objective information I need. There's too much ambiguity, and I've got to do something now. I'm probably going to act more on biases. And if I'm not getting feedback on my decisions, the consequences of those actions, it's easy to keep doing it. And so we can limit the impact first by becoming aware of our biases. Where is it that we have positive and negative perceptions based on physical characteristics? Acknowledge that we have them, and just very quickly, I don't think this is as common, but I've heard it in rural parts of the state still quite a bit. This idea that if I just treat everybody the same, I don't see your race, I don't see your sex, that means that I'm acting in an equal way. Well, one, it's just dishonest. We do see those, we are aware of them, but two, we need to acknowledge that we actually not only see it, but that it influences our thinking. And I think it's very easy, if I violate your social norms, you become immediately aware of this. If I was on your screen right now wearing a dress, you would react differently to me than I am wearing a suit and tie. And that's just real. We have to acknowledge that. And then we have to be able to proactively monitor, look at the decisions I'm making and see, are there patterns in this that suggest that I am more favorable to one group than another? I think role playing is a really easy way to control this. It's very hard to discriminate against yourself. Like when I applied to the job in San Diego, I carefully wrote a cover letter. I carefully wrote my resume in hopes that someone would read that closely and evaluate me based on my knowledge, skills, abilities, demonstrated successes. I didn't think, I hope they screen this, look at the top and see Greg Smith, think that sounds like a tall white guy, he's probably qualified, on to the next. If we role play in that way, if I was the person behind this piece of paper I'm looking at right now, how would I want you to look at this? It becomes harder to go based on biases in your decision making. And so ways that we can do this: be honest in your note taking, jot down the first thing you're thinking. You'd be surprised what you might go back and read if you don't filter it first to make it more acceptable, but just write your first thoughts, what it is you think positively or negatively. If you can isolate yourself, you can say it out loud. And we're more likely to blurt out something than when we write it, because that's a mechanical action that takes a little more thought. But you will say things very quickly and then realize, oh wait, that's not quite what I wanted to say or meant, and we correct ourselves, right? We do this all the time socially when we think we might have said something kind of the wrong way or we're going to be perceived negatively. If you can take that initial statement that got blurted out about a candidate and evaluate what is behind that. Why did I say it that way? Why am I thinking about this candidate that way? Is this being influenced by associations based on what I can perceive in their race or their sex? We can now deal with that. If I can eliminate distractions so that I can give conscious effort to this. We have to check our energy level as we get tired. When you're in that 9th interview of the day, the 10th hour, you've heard the same answer to the same questions already. It's very easy to stop actively engaging and to just capture kind of the high level thoughts that you hear that you've decided are the most important factors, and to stop thinking more proactively about how biases might be playing. And then I think it's really important, this is what the data is going to do for us, is we got to get feedback. Does the data on our decision show a pattern of preference for one group over the other? If I were to tell somebody else what I'm thinking about, and we can do this within our committees as we talk about candidates, would we see a pattern emerge? And then ultimately, as the research shows, the more opportunities I have to interact with people from different backgrounds than my own, the more I can unlearn negative associations and relearn positive associations. So moving into the data analysis portion, our longitudinal analysis, and this is what the Chancellor's Office requires us to do for EEO funding. We look at our applicant pools by race, ethnicity, and sex over a period of time. And we see who came in and then who got hired, to see if there are any systemic patterns of adverse impact, that is a lower selection rate for one group over the other. And so this is an example of what that looks like. We use what's called the 80% rule. This comes from the EEOC, Department of Labor, and Department of Justice. It's an initial threshold just to say, look closer at this. And so if we looked at an overall hiring rate in a 4-year period, and we saw that 5%, over 5% of the white applicants who applied got hired, less than 4% of the Hispanic applicants got hired, we see that initial adverse impact, and that's what the math looks like. The 3.98% divided by the 0.19, that's smaller than 0.80. We say look closer. And that look closer is break the hiring process into stages. What happens when who meets minimum qualifications, who gets selected for an interview, who gets advanced to a second level interview, whatever the steps are when anyone falls out. And so in this model, let's say that 37% of the white applicants who applied get selected for an interview, 19%. And so we see for Hispanic applicants, we see where the first real barriers happening, right? Almost half the selection rate. And that has adverse impact. And an important note is you look at the whole numbers that I use in this example. In whole numbers, more Latinx applicants were interviewed than white applicants, 963 to 945. But compared to the pool of people that applied during this 4-year time frame, this 5-year time frame, we would have expected far more, nearly twice as many Hispanic or Latinx applicants to be interviewed, given how predominant they are in that applicant pool. So now we can dig deeper. And this is where we have an opportunity to collect more data and understand what it is that affects who's selected for a first level interview. And what we want to identify is, are those legitimate job-related factors, or are they potentially discriminatory factors because they don't have that close relationship with job performance? And so if we think about what are our minimum qualifications and our preferred qualifications, a number of years of experience, a certain level of education, whether or not someone possesses certifications, and then how a screening committee is ranking people. As we've decided, whatever those criteria are, I'm going to score you a 4 and you a 3, and what goes into the thinking around how I assign that rating. How do we look at candidates who come into our pool and meet qualifications by demonstrating equivalency? Do we put a higher bar for them than we do candidates who have a traditional degree that meets our minimum qualifications? Do we have things like mandatory interviews in our bargaining agreements such that a person has to be pushed through this? And so does that affect what we see in our pool going forward because of a rule like that? And we can look at specifically, does that advantage or disadvantage applicants based on their race or their sex? We'll talk about something like reference letters a little bit here in a moment. So we just take an example of this in a nursing faculty position. Minimum qualification, 1 year of nursing education experience. The preferred qualification, 3 years in a college level setting. And then we collect data. Who meets this? Yes, no. And then how much do they have? How much of that experience? And so if we were to look at this applicant pool and we saw that nearly 80% of our white applicants had that minimum 1 year nursing education experience. Almost 75%, 74% had that 3 years of college level. The average amount of experience for the white applicants that we interviewed had 4.2 years of experience, 3.78 of the college level experience. But we did interview some white applicants who had as little as just the minimum, just that 1 year, and none of the college level. Compare that to the experience of our Latinx candidates. So 56% met the minimum qualifications. Only 25% met that preferred qualification. The average amount of experience for the Latinx candidates that we interviewed, nearly 6 years. The average college level, nearly 5 years. The lowest amount of experience for anybody that got invited to an interview that was Latinx, 3.5 years. And 2.5 years of college level. If we compare that, we see, so right off the bat, there is a disparity in who's meeting that minimum qualification. And that leads me to think we need to look at how we can recruit more qualified Latinx applicants. The preferred qualification has a real significant impact. And my immediate fear is that Latinx candidates have a harder time getting jobs in other places to get that experience. If there are discriminatory decisions being made outside of our institution, are we embedding some of that into this qualification? And so we want to scrutinize, how much does that preferred qualification translate into higher level performance? If it does, then it's legitimate. And we think about recruiting. If it doesn't, maybe there's a better way to establish qualifications that are more job related. But then we look at the decisions that were made about who got invited to the interview. And I would argue that what we see in that next set of data around the average years is that we held Latinx candidates to a higher standard than we did white candidates. And that's where we see the impact of preferences or favorable assumptions about people. That if you were a white candidate, I gave you more benefit of the doubt. If you were a Latinx candidate, I really made you prove it to me that you were qualified. And that's kind of what's summarized in those observations there. And so then we have to think about, are we applying the standard unequally, consciously and explicitly, or are we doing it more unintentionally, but it's still happening? The data is what drives me to go ask those questions. And I know we're a little bit over time. I guess let me stop and ask, is it okay if I go about 10 minutes longer than we had scheduled?
Let's look at how to measure bias in ourselves and in others. Here's Dolly Chug from NYU.
We sent emails to real professors in real universities.
They contacted over 6,500 professors at random from 260 American universities.
We sent them an email that looked like it came from a real person asking for a meeting to learn more about the PhD program in that university. But we randomly assigned whether the fictional person sending that email had a name that sounded male or female and sounded white, Chinese, Hispanic, Indian, or Black. What we found that is if you were a white male, you were far more likely to receive a response back than if you were in all those other categories put together as a group.
Some of this could be explicit racism, but it's far more likely that in many cases, these professors are just busy. They can't respond to every email they get, so they kind of let their subconscious decide for them. And that's where their biases come through. Research shows that our racial biases are often more about who we choose to help than who we don't. And we tend to help people who are similar to us. But you aren't 6,500 randomly selected professors. So how can you figure out where you might be making similar unconscious choices? First, there's a well-known test online you can take that can help show you biases you hold. Or
just do an audit. Whatever data you have, whether it's formal data in a computer or whether it's just data that's sort of anecdotal, look at the data. For example, I met this fantastic executive in Silicon Valley. He takes great pride in being someone who actively tries to achieve gender balance on his teams, knowing that Silicon Valley and tech are skewed heavily male.
So he looked at his professional social network, his Twitter, his LinkedIn.
He found his network was far more skewed male than he expected. So there's a place where he could actively work to shift that, and that's what he's been doing since then.
So this is not a scientifically exact self-audit, but it can still be useful, and you can audit anything. So maybe start by taking that online test for bias. Maybe check out whose emails you're replying to. But you can also audit yourself for implicit bias by asking a friend to observe you in the real world. If you're a teacher, have people look at who you call on most in class. Whatever your interactions are.
One practical thing that people should do is take stock of their friends. It would be very useful for people to actually make lists of people with whom they spend time.
Look for patterns. That's the audit. That's the assessment we can all do.
So a really important point that I take out of that is that a lot of this is about preference and who we choose to associate with, especially as we think about our hiring process and who we give that benefit of the doubt. And that's one of the key things that I hope you come away with is thinking about as you're participating in selection committees, where does benefit of the doubt come in? Where do we make assumptions about a candidate positively or negatively, not based on what we can objectively see, but in the absence of the objective information? And I know that Santa Monica is not using or requesting or requiring reference letters anymore as part of the application process, but this makes for a very useful example in the context of that video. And so when we think about reference letters, there are still several institutions that have a requirement to submit some number of letters from professional references. The question that begs is who has access to high quality references, which is less about how qualified you are and how much you have a network of people that are willing to help you. And so if we collect data on that point, this is what it might look like. If a college wanted to evaluate this practice and see if it results in a disparity, you could ask just the simple, were they able to submit 3 letters? Yes, no, and we can go in and capture that. Some people are going to see 3 and think, well, that really means if I give you 5, you're going to think really highly of me, right? And so they'll give you more. And then we can ask committee members, did the letters of reference positively influence your decision on this candidate, or did they negatively? And capture, yes, there was a positive, or yes, no, there was a negative. With that data, we could see, okay, who submitted the 3 letters, and we see a slight disparity for Latinx candidates there. We see the number of letters submitted higher for the white candidates. And then we see the reaction of people to those letters. And in this example, for the white applicants, they were predominantly viewed as a positive thing, less so for the Latinx candidates. And so we can conclude from this, Latinx candidates may have a more difficult time getting that professional reference. There may be fewer people willing to do them that favor. White applicants might be getting more positive letters when they're able to get them than Latinx candidates. They may have greater access to references. And in what we see in that positive and negative impact, Latinx candidates may have to overcome a bias or a preference or a negative association in relation to the references. All questions to ask. These aren't conclusions I'm drawing. It's just inquiries I want to make now about this process, because I know after I was able to look at the data that there is a disparity about this. And so we think about, what are we inferring from the letter? What does that tell us? Are we valuing the letter differently? Do we look at where that person who wrote that letter works, or what title they hold, and assign greater weight to their input than we would somebody else? How do we interpret the information that we read? Do we see kind of glowing remarks about a person with no real substance and read that as a quality reference? Or are we looking for more, this is what a person actually did with some real outcomes? And then what evidence do we have that supports or contradicts what we see in the reference letter? And I've seen a number of examples where this happened, as I've participated in these processes, where someone writes something about a person in a letter. They have amazing Excel skills, but as I look at their application materials and when I talk to them in an interview, I'm not hearing that. I'm not seeing evidence of it. And is there an alternative that I could get more objective information that's less subjective to bias? Whatever it is that the letter is providing me, are there other ways to get that information that is not going to have some of these problems attached with it? That's what the data does for us, is it can drive a conversation. It helps us see where the barriers happen. And now we can talk about what those decision points mean for us as we think about what our minimum qualifications are. And yes, some of those we cannot change, right? They're in Title V. It can really drive a conversation around what we state as preferred qualifications. Are we pushing for doctorates when masters are required? And is there a barrier now because of that doctorate? Because it takes, I think, two things you absolutely must have to get a doctorate, which is a lot of time and a certain amount of money or access to money. And those aren't evenly available to people, right? Socioeconomic status and race are very correlated. As we go through screening criteria, how well do they predict performance? If we see a screening criteria is eliminating larger numbers of a particular race, ethnicity, sex, let's have a conversation on how those criteria really translate into performance on the job. We can also talk about behavioral barriers, the way we act. Are there inconsistencies in the subjective conclusions we draw from objective information? Can we see patterns of positive or negative subjective conclusions? How are our biases, implicit and explicit, coming into our selection decisions? Are we imposing higher standards on certain groups because of those expectations? Are we using criteria that aren't really related to job performance, but we've always used them? We feel very comfortable with them and we hate to give them up just because they're comfortable, but they aren't really doing what we think they do. And underscoring all of this, are we prioritizing our student outcomes for every job? The ability to engage with a diverse community successfully. Are we treating that as a fundamental, if you don't have this, you can't work here type of qualification, the same way we do technical competence? And I frame all of this within, as an institution, what are we selling to our students? And I don't mean to use selling in a, as customer service type of, I think education is something different than that. But in effect, a student is buying kind of this set of things, right? I can show up on a certain day and time, absent COVID, and there's going to be a class, and there's a certain level of instruction that's going to happen. There's going to be an accreditation standard that's met. all of these functional things, but that's not what we think about. I did not think about any of this. I wasn't like, oh, I'm going to apply to USC. I hear they're really punctual. You're thinking about the outcome, right? I'm going to have these moments of engagement where there's learning breakthroughs, and somebody's going to sit down and help me to understand a complex idea. And I'm going to gain this body of knowledge. And ultimately, I'm going to graduate. I'm going to get that certificate. I'm going to get that higher paying job. It's going to open up economic mobility. It's going to transform my health outcomes, and for me and my family over the course of our life. It's that engagement. Can we create those successes with everybody we interact with, not just people that are the same of us? And so what I think that means is that as we evaluate someone's knowledge, skills, and ability, as we look at their experience and what we can glean about the demonstrated successes that they've had in their past, that is all part of us projecting their success. And so if we frame this conversation around, based on what I read when they held this job at that company, I think they would do this thing that's required in the job they've applied for here really well. And it's all underwritten by how they're going to engage with the people that we're serving as a college. If I can talk about projected success through engagement with our diverse population, students, faculty, administrators, classified staff, everybody, we're all part of this diverse community. If I can talk about projected success based on what I saw through their engagement, I think we turned that fundamental ability to serve a diverse student population into a true minimum qualification. It's not just that they know everything there is to know about statistics. It's that they can engage with a wide variety of students successfully as they teach statistics. Equally important. I'm going to come out of full screen now so I can see the chat. I saw a number of things come up. But really appreciate the time to share this with you and talk about this. Monica asked, this is a key, which folks get to comprise the committees. Absolutely, that is a huge part of this. And I think it's one of the more important conversations that we need to have with Academic Senate, with our classified senates and associations, in our participatory processes, about what do we put as that requirement? And is it all going to be based on expertise in the discipline or in the job? Or are we going to invite people from other parts of our community that can bring a perspective about the engagement piece? They may not be able to tell us how well that person understands fundamentals of electricity and what a great electrician they're going to be, but they can say, as a person who needs electricians to come to my office periodically, when I heard them talk about this, they're going to engage really well. They're going to serve our office really well. Or what I heard suggests there's going to be real issues there. And I don't think they would do that part of the job well. And so thinking about how do we get people from different parts of our campus to participate in this. Any other final thoughts or comments or questions? And thank you so much for giving me some additional time.
All right. If you have any questions, please unmute yourself. If not, we're going to go ahead and wrap up. I want to give a big thank you to Greg Smith. He does a lot of great work around the state for the whole entire community college system. We are grateful for you and your work. I also want to say congratulations to you in your new role at San Diego Community College District. They are in a very good place having you. So thank you for joining us. Thank you to everyone who stayed around to get this very important information. And with that, we will adjourn this workshop. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody. Really appreciated the opportunity.